start with the absolutely horrifying news that happened over the last couple of days that the Senate has allowed the FBI to search your browser history without a warrant. This is part of a larger package to, in terms of reading up on the Patriot Act, which shouldn't be done regardless. This bill passed with 10 votes from Democrats and Bernie Sanders, certainly to the everlasting shame of the 10 Democrats and Bernie Sanders, shamefully, I will say, as a big Bernie Sanders fan, obviously, actually missed this vote for whatever reason. Now, this is an extraordinary escalation. The idea that the FBI can look at anybody's web browser histories without even a warrant, basically at the discretion of Bill Barr, who has a very serious contempt for civil liberties and open institutions, deems it necessary, they can look at your browser history. This should threaten and concern all of us. And of course, this fits a much longer pattern of the erosion of privacy and civil liberties, some of which we talked with Glenn Greenwald about last week, if you haven't seen it yet. The Patriot Act passed after the September 11th attacks, the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. We saw the massive NSA surveillance that was revealed by Edward Snowden's whistleblowing and reported in 2012 with still no significant reforms. We've seen a FISA court that essentially functions as a rubber stamp for requests from the government for spying and monitoring. Now, in the Senate, and in Congress, there are constructive political coalitions that have mostly unsuccessfully pushed back against this encroachment on our privacy and rights. And those coalitions involve people on the left and progressives, obviously, and libertarian-oriented folks on the right, your Justin Amash's or Rand Paul or Mike Lee's. And legislatively, this is really, really important. But philosophically and analytically, we need to make a distinction here between a libertarian concern for civil rights and civil liberties that only sees the government, which of course the government certainly can be and is a deep threat to our privacy and civil liberties, as exemplified by programs conducted by the CIA, NSA, and others, but stop short at holding private power accountable because of their market fundamentalist politics. And a socialist approach would have to recognize that, first of all, the modern national security state is a permeable sort of integration of public and private interests, that even going back to the NSA spying revelations, we saw significant use of private contractors, collaboration with telecoms and other private interests in getting our data. Corona has opened up new ways of partnering with private companies like Apple and Google to monitor people's behavior. Some of this might be necessary for things like tracing and other urgent areas necessary for containing the virus, but they open up entirely new ranges of encroachment on people's privacy, from their movements to their data. And this is a threat to everybody in their day in and day out lives, and certainly a threat to folks who want to engage in politics in times of increasing austerity and authoritarian tendencies internationally. And it's really important, though, to understand that in some ways the engine of this repression now is private. It does not come from the public sector in the same way. It comes from this integration between private and public, and taking on the private is more difficult than taking on the public. Even in today's world, with a lot of timidity around exposing the wrongdoings of the CIA and US foreign policy, that much more difficult to seriously and systemically look at corporate power in this country and its threats to our civil liberties. And I want to talk about a great piece that was written by the journalist Mark Ames in a now defunct website, Pando Daily, that came out May 28th, 2015. And I'd recommend everybody read this article. It was an in-depth look at Seymour Hersh, the incredibly well-known and well-regarded investigative journalist who exposed the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and up until I think to this day has done significant work in exposing the wrongdoings of the U.S. national security state, CIA, foreign policy, and any number of significant areas of that relevant to foreign policy and civil liberties. I'm going to quote now from Mark Ames, and because he talks about the term muckraking journalism. In its original meaning, muckraking journalism was all about exposing the awful power that corporations, trusts, and monopolies exercised over people on the broader interest. So why doesn't Seymour Hersh, considered the premier muckraker of the past few decades, turn his fearless muckraking guns on private corporate power? And what unfolds from this article is in no ways a condemnation of Seymour Hersh. It's actually a moving and disturbing sort of story of Seymour Hersh's attempts in the mid-70s at the height of his career success and with some backing from his employer, the New York Times, to take the same investigative approach that he had used to expose U.S. foreign policy and CIA wrongdoing, to take on a massive corporate conglomerate in the 1970s, Gulf and Western, which had its fingers in everything from Dominican sugar fields, oil, the film industry. It had connections to organized crime, and it impacted most areas of American life. Seymour Hersh wanted to do the same treatment for this private company that he had done for the U.S. intelligence service. And I'll quote now again from Ames. Hersh's massive Gulf and Western expose was published in the Times in 1977, 13,000 words long in 3 parts, revealing a private labyrinth of corporate fraud, abuse, tax avoidance schemes, and mobbed up malfeasance. Yet, in spite of all the pre-publication hype, the story landed with a whimper, something Hersh wasn't at all used to. I expected a lot more explosive stuff, commented a former G&W executive. The reasons were pretty straightforward. Unlike Hersh's stories going after the CIA and the military, the Times was more afraid and careful of the consequences of taking on a powerful private company, Gulf and Western, and getting sued out of existence. Unlike Hersh's muckraking stories about illegal CIA spying and military massacres, the Times saddled Hersh with a team of editors and lawyers to vet his reporting, sucking the life out of his piece until it was almost unreadable. Among other things, the Times cut all of the colorful anonymous quotes that made his muckraking bombshells on the CIA and more recently on the Osama bin Laden killing such memorable reads. Now, this is an incredibly good piece. I'd recommend you'd read it, and a lot of Mark Ames's reporting. He's a really, really good reporter. But this would only more significantly apply today. We've seen complete gutting of journalism in general. Investigative capacities have been radically diminished, and corporations, even more so than government, are absolutely, and this piece documents it even going back to the 70s, ruthless in their willingness to threaten in every way, shape, and form journalism so that it does not expose their systemic wrongdoing. Fast forwarding to today, with that terrifying piece of legislation passed in the Senate, something that I think even Mitch McConnell thought he was stretching to put in that bill, but ended up getting passed with the help of Democrats like Sheldon Whitehouse and Bob Casey. We got to look at these new surveillance systems as public-private partnerships and understand that the private is even harder to expose and has way more power than the public. So legislation and work in Congress and partnerships between the left and right on containing those abuses is incredibly important legislatively, but we also need to have a much bigger critique and understanding of what actually threatens our rights, from journalism to privacy, and it's the corporate sector.
Definitely. I mean, this week has been pretty devastating for writers over at Vice. Many of them have been let go. And yeah, it's just devastating because we've seen this like dismantling of important journalism, not just yesterday, but for a while now. And there really aren't many places for muckraking journalists to even work without fear of censorship or retaliation if they refuse to go along with what their editors want. And so now more than ever, I agree with you. It's important to do what we can to protect journalism. And I also think it's important to not, not get too distracted by the antics of Donald Trump and place all the blame of what's happening to journalists on him, even though he has been brutal, disgusting, obviously someone who doesn't see violations of the First Amendment as much of an issue. But he's really a symptom of what we've been seeing for decades now. And so, the way he riles up protesters to attack journalists should be condemned. But I think that it should also be condemned when you see all of these journalists get fired, in order to provide a return on investment for media investors, right? That's another big issue that we're seeing. And going back to Trump supporters for just a second, and some of the people who have been protesting the stay-at-home orders, I just always find it so fascinating when people say that they're concerned about a tyrannical government. They're concerned about a government that's too big, that would violate their constitutional rights. And they think staying home to slow the spread of this pandemic is an example of that. But in reality, I mean, our freedoms have been scaled back quite a bit since 2001. Government has only gotten bigger in all the wrong ways. And it's just incredible how much we're losing the messaging war on that, right? Because all the focus is on the wrong things. We should be focusing on the ways that government, with the help of corporations, with the, relationship with corporations, have infringed on so many of our rights, including privacy rights.
Totally. And that's why I think it's really important that we don't cede that conversation and we talk about what threatens these things, period. And it is these big institutions, and many of them are private. And essentially, look, it is a private public hybrid. But I love in that Mark Ames piece that his point is that, as terrifying as it is to go up against the intelligence apparatus, it's even more dangerous in many respects to go up against private power. So we really need to keep that in mind. Another thing I wanted to just say about Trump, and look, I want to actually be balanced about this because, part of the reason that everybody I think does overreact and isn't strategic about Trump at times, partially because of all the dumb shit that we see in the resistance, and we've talked about that plenty of times. The mainstream Democratic Party is embarrassing. But obviously, Donald Trump does, stupid, despicable, avarice things on a daily basis. That's also true in part of the diet, obviously. So it is, I can understand why it's tricky for people. But I'm thinking really specifically, there's a new report that just came out in the Financial Times that does a really good job of going to the specifics of all the ways in which Donald Trump specifically, and of course there's a system failure, there's a collapse of public health care. Andrew Cuomo needs to be grilled relentlessly, absolutely. And Donald Trump has done everything wrong that you could possibly do. And as president, he bears the most responsibility from the catastrophe of this pandemic and the loss of human life and the economics of it, everything else. The buck does stop with him. And this Financial Times piece goes into just great detail on his, his brattiness, his arrogance, his psychopathy in terms of, human life, and his total lack of interest in the consequences. And it's a really good piece. It's an important piece. Everybody should be sharing it and reading it. And honestly, the first thing that struck me when I tweeted out was this one actually is really important. But because of the 50 other pieces about his funny tweets or, whatever else, and again, it all gets conflated, which is another really big problem. This is another huge problem with the resistance is it's if you have a feed where it's Donald Trump is running a vicious racist border policy, which he is, and then that's next to Donald Trump said something that actually makes a lot of intuitive sense to people about a trade tariff. And then that's next to he tweeted out something hilarious about a politician or entertainer that nobody likes. You're not only are you're strategically wrong, you're really undermining the punch of the one thing in that 3 list that is actually really serious. But I also think the onus is on us, for all of us who are sick of the melodrama and the stupidity and the lack of strategy around Trump, to also remember things like this Financial Times article, that this guy is presiding over a failed state, absolutely does not care. And I have no doubt in their calculus, they look at the demographic rundowns of who's dying from the virus, and they think to themselves, no problem, those aren't our voters.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you can almost see it happening in real time, especially with some of the Fox News hosts like Tucker Carlson, who took the pandemic seriously in the beginning. And then all of a sudden he had a change of heart. Like, where did that change of heart come from? And it was after some of those statistics were released showing who's disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. But, you know, in regard to Trump's tweets, I agree with you 100%. I just feel like this need to relitigate whether Donald Trump is racist based on a tweet is nonsense. He's racist. We all know it. We don't need to keep relitigating it. Of course. And so definitely raise alarm when you see actual constitutional rights being violated by the commander in chief. Like, that's a huge issue. And that's when you need to raise the alarm. But the billionth story about Trump saying or doing something racist is not something that needs to be like relitigated. I think that it's safe. It's safe at this point to move on to the next step, right? Instead of asking the same damn question over and over again.
Let alone when he says something.
Like go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and let alone when he's just saying something that's funny or something that actually will make some sense to some people. I mean, that was another thing that happened with Trump. The way he's attacking NATO, I don't agree with, although we do need to ultimately radically change NATO. But, you know, like the idea that normal people are sitting around going like, oh, I can't believe he would insult our European partners like that. No, they're not. That's going to make a hell of a lot of sense intuitively what he's saying, even if it's, you know, you can complicate it about like, why should we pay all the money and not get things back? And it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, there just hasn't really been an effective response to any of his like online provocations. It's only helped to like strengthen his base and their support for him. But I love this story, and I love that you came at it from a very different perspective than what we've seen covered in the media, which is, hey, let's also focus on how private industry is involved in this, and how devastating that is, especially when private industry has so much of our data to begin with, right?
Absolutely.
And the NSA, government agencies who feel the need to spy on Americans indiscriminately do so with the help of private industry. That's what we learned through Edward Snowden. You know, you have the telecommunications companies willy-nilly handing this data to government agencies who demand it. And so it's just something that we need to keep in mind, because everything that we're doing, especially now during this pandemic, so many people are working from home. All of this information, all of this data is vulnerable to abuse.
Absolutely.